Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop, this pawn advances, immediately challenging central control and launching an aggressive opening. Immediately contesting the center with an equal pawn-pawn is a time-honored response, setting the stage for a dynamic symmetrical struggle. Developing the knight to f3 directly contests the e5 pawn and prepares for castling, a fundamental principle for king's safety. Developing a piece that contests the center is standard, reinforcing a flexible pawn structure and preparing for queenside expansion. Instantly challenging black's pawn structure and eyeing central control, this maneuver initiates a classic strategic duel. Challenging the bishop's placement, this knight's advance immediately ignites central pawn struggles and prepares for active piece play. Consolidating the pawn structure and preparing for a king's Indian attack setup, this subtle maneuver offers white more flexibility in the center. Developing the bishop here creates a diagonal threat towards white's king, adding immediate tactical pressure. Trading off the knight that guarded the d-pawn liberates black's queenside structure, potentially opening lines for bishop activity. Doubling pawns creates structural weaknesses in the queenside, but opens the d-file for potential piece activity. Securely tucking the monarch away, white prioritizes safety after black's slight pawn structure concession. This action clears the d1 square for potential future rook activity and prepares for a more expansive central game. Re-establishing a defender for the e5 pawn and preparing to reroute the bishop offers some solace, but the doubled pawns on the c-file leave a lingering positional scar that's difficult to heal without significant concessions later. Bolstering the center and preparing for a queenside expansion, white signals intent to build a solid pawn structure before unleashing piece activity. Shielding the king and preparing for central action, black repositions their bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure and anticipating future pawn pushes. Fortifying the central pawn and preparing to potentially advance the e-file, this rook's repositioning anticipates future struggles for open lines and offers support to the d3 pawn should a pawn break materialize. Seeking to consolidate its central presence, this knight maneuvers from its defensive post, eyeing a potential redeployment towards the kingside or a more active central square. The doubled pawns on black's queenside, while a structural weakness, now grant the bishop on c5 a clearer diagonal. White's rook now occupies the open file, a clear indication of intentions to contest the center. Launching a pawn into the center immediately challenges black's cramped queenside and aims to seize the initiative, potentially opening lines for white's rooks. This aggressive push seeks to disrupt black's harmonious development and create imbalances, forcing a decision on how to handle the central tension. Undermining the center and opening a potential path for the queen, this move strategically weakens black's pawn structure, particularly on the king side, creating long-term weaknesses that white can later exploit with precise piece placement and well-timed pawn advances. Developing the knight to d2 offers flexibility, potentially reinforcing the center or preparing a queenside expansion without immediately committing the other knight. Consider the pawn structure. White has created a doubled pawn for black on the c-file. This move aims to exploit that structural imbalance by preparing to attack along the semi-open c-file or by creating pressure against black's queenside defenses. Securing the monarch against potential central advances becomes the immediate priority, a prudent step given the open nature of the center and the bishop pair white possesses. Shifting the knight to f1, a seemingly passive retreat, is a subtle repositioning aimed at bolstering the kingside and potentially preparing a kingside attack by clearing the f3 square for the other knight or even the bishop, while also reinforcing the d3 pawn and opening diagonal possibilities for the queen. The rook sidles back, anticipating the potential opening of the e-file and offering refuge while simultaneously eyeing the central pawn structure. The knight's journey to g3 signals a potential regrouping, aiming to shift pressure towards the kingside and possibly prepare for an advance of the f-pawn, challenging the pawn chain black has meticulously built. This maneuver could also facilitate a later maneuver where the knight hops to f5, creating a potent attacking force if black is not vigilant. Liberating that a pawn is a bold step, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially create attacking avenues on the flank, though it does invite scrutiny of the queenside pawn chain and might offer white opportunities to exploit the newly created weakness if not carefully managed. Shifting the knight to f5 directly challenges the opponent's castled king's safety, hinting at a potential kingside attack by threatening squares like g7. The bishop retreats, seeking a safer haven from the knight's imposing presence on f5. This maneuver allows for potential future development to e7 or g6, aiming to bolster the kingside defenses and perhaps facilitate a kingside pawn advance later, although the initial cost of this retreat is relinquishing control of the long diagonal. White initiates a pawn storm, seeking to unravel black's queenside pawn structure and create attacking opportunities against the enemy king by relentlessly advancing the kingside pawns. Black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially gain space, but it concedes further control of the central squares, particularly the d5 outpost, and weakens the b4 square. Pressuring the queenside advance, this pawn push aims to shatter black's pawn structure and gain significant space, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and forcing concessions. Black seeks to dismantle white's pawn shield on the kingside and create counterplay on the queenside, aiming to open lines for their pieces. Exploiting the raised pawn structure, this capture immediately opens the d-file and challenges black's central pawn majority, aiming to disrupt black's knight outposts and potentially create attacking chances against the uncastled king's side. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight immediately contests the d4 square, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn chain and open diagonals for black's bishops. This aggressive recapture repositions the knight to a more active central outpost, threatening to fork the king and rook should white's g-pawn advance further. While it grants white a potential open e-file, black is clearly seeking dynamic counterplay and is willing to accept some pawn structure concessions for increased piece activity. Clearing the center pawns initiates a dynamic phase, as the knight trades a square of influence for immediate piece activity on a central file, potentially opening lines toward black's king. Sensing a decisive shift, black immediately seizes the opportunity to simplify, accepting the queen exchange and initiating an endgame where white's weakened kingside pawn structure might become a lingering liability. Recapturing the queen with the rook immediately opens the d-file for your rooks, creating a powerful battery that targets black's exposed king and threatens to infiltrate their position. This bold exchange simplifies the material but sacrifices some pawn structure integrity in the center, demanding careful coordination of your remaining pieces to exploit the initiative gained. Reshaping the pawn structure now introduces a doubled pawn on the e-file, a significant positional concession that may prove problematic in the long run, potentially creating weaknesses rather than avenues for counterplay. Pondering the pawn thrust, white secures the b4 square, preventing potential black queenside expansion and preparing a slow but steady queenside buildup. Repositioning the rook to the open d-file immediately intensifies the pressure on white's central pawns, aiming to disrupt the pawn chain and potentially create attacking opportunities on the queenside with the support of the knight. Initiating a diagonal thrust, this placement aims to disrupt black's knight on d7 and potentially target weaknesses around the king if the central pawn chain breaks open. White is eyeing control of the d-file and seeks to activate their pieces while black's queenside push has stalled. Sacrificing the exchange to simplify into a more manageable endgame, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure with the subsequent recapture. Recapturing with the rook solidifies white's control over the d-file, a crucial open highway now that the queens have been exchanged, and prepares to challenge black's own rook for dominance. Unleashing the g-pawn here dramatically alters the pawn structure, initiating a battle for kingside space and potentially opening a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, though it concurrently weakens the dark squares around the black king. Opening up lines with the pawn is a bold decision, creating a potential pathway for your rook to infiltrate the kingside. Be mindful of the immediate structural consequences, as this pawn structure can become a target if not adequately supported, and black's knight on e5 is perfectly poised to exploit the newfound space. The fight for central control intensifies as a result of this capture, and anticipating black's next positional maneuver will be paramount in dictating the flow of the middle game. Opening up the h-file creates immediate tactical complications, forcing black to address the potential for white's rook to become very active on this newly liberated line. This pawn structure change dramatically alters the positional landscape, potentially exposing the black king later if play shifts decisively to the king side, and demands careful calculation from black to avoid falling into immediate traps. Exploring the center with the knight, this repositioning aims to challenge black's somewhat passive pawn structure and eye potential breakthroughs on the king side or even a central push. The monarch abandons its sheltered haven, venturing onto the exposed central highway. A bold, albeit risky, decision that immediately draws the attention of the enemy knight and potentially exposes the king side to further penetration. Fortifying the king's refuge, this move proactively defends against any incursions along the f-file, ensuring the monarch remains shielded from potential knight forks or bishop checks, while simultaneously preparing a potential g3 pawn push to further enhance king's safety and create a more robust pawn structure against black's active pieces. Acknowledging the recent exchanges of pieces and the doubling of pawns on the c-file, the bishop's retreat to d6 signals a strategic repositioning, aiming to solidify the pawn chain and potentially re-enter the game by supporting central advances or seeking counterplay on the queen side, all while keeping a watchful eye on any lingering weaknesses around the king. Solidifying your king's central anchor now begins the slow, deliberate process of king's safety after the recent exchanges, aiming to prevent any sneaky pawn advances from black's bishop that might threaten your monarch. Initiating a powerful rook lift, the black rook embarks on a journey to the king side, aiming to bolster the beleaguered monarch and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. Chasing the king from its comfortable castle, white initiates a daring pawn storm, seeking to pry open the center and expose black's monarch to the elements. Securing the bishop on b3 offers black a formidable outpost, pressuring white's queen side and potentially creating weaknesses on the c2 square. Seeking to solidify the central pawn structure and prepare a kingside advance, this rook repositioning aims to create a more harmonious pawn formation, potentially opening lines for future pawn pushes. Unleashing the monarch from its sanctuary, the black king boldly steps into the fray, seeking active participation and potential counterplay amidst the simmering tension on the king side. Reigniting the central struggle with knight repositioning, aiming to exploit the rather exposed dark squares around black's monarch. Embracing the space on the queen side, b5 initiates a bold expansion, seeking to dislodge white's central structure and create counterplay through pawn advances. This move signals a clear intent to seize the initiative on that flank, potentially opening lines for the rook or creating passed pawn opportunities if white isn't attentive. The pawn storm aims to restrict white's pieces and force concessions, turning the game into a more dynamic and potentially sharp affair. Unleashing a pawn storm in this endgame is a bold gambit, aiming to crack open the king side and exploit the slightly passive placement of black's pieces, though it does leave white's own king with fewer defenders. Capturing the pawn with your king shatters white's attacking structure, opening critical lines for your rook and bishop while simultaneously forcing the white king into a more exposed position. Unlocking the bishop pair is a game changer, immediately bringing white's pieces into a more coordinated attacking posture. The rook's repositioning to the open file offers immediate influence and threatens to disrupt white's developing pieces, aiming to exploit the central tension and potentially open lines towards the king side. Securing the rook on the third rank prepares for a potential advance on the king side, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering space and create threats against the exposed monarch. Snatching the bishop with the rook is a bold decision, sacrificing immediate material for potential dynamic counterplay on the newly opened rook file. Capturing the rook on f4 fundamentally alters the material balance, creating an immediate advantage for white and simplifying the position into a more manageable endgame. The rook sacrifice is a desperate attempt to inject some life into a collapsing position, but this pawn push sadly solidifies white's advantage by opening the h-file for the enemy king and offering little counterplay. Unleashing the central pawn promises to disrupt the pawn chain and potentially open lines for white's remaining pieces, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed king position. Sacrificing the pawn opens a vital diagonal for your king, but be keenly aware of the increased pressure on your monarch now that the central pawn shield has been significantly compromised. The king steps out of the shadows, embracing the newfound open lines to support the remaining pawn structure, a bold shift from passive defense to active participation in the unfolding endgame dynamics. The rook pawn's advance, while liberating the bishop, now leaves the king exposed to potential checks on the g-file, a strategic trade-off to consider for future play. Pivoting the knight to e3 strategically reclaims a central outpost, preparing to contest the d5 square and potentially launch an assault on black's compromised queenside pawn structure. The bishop repositions, a subtle effort to secure the d6 square once more and prepare for potential challenges on the kingside, even as the passed pawn on e5 poses a significant threat. The knight's re-entry onto f5 aims to control the vital d6 square and pressure the weak f7 pawn, creating new tactical possibilities and restricting black's king's freedom to maneuver. Unlocking the bishop's potential to threaten white's pawn structure offers a glimmer of activity after a rather passive sequence of play. A proactive step to claim central territory and solidify the pawn chain, aiming to restrict black's bishop and open a path for the king to join the central fray. The black bishop, after its extended tour of the queenside, finds a surprisingly comfortable outpost on b1, offering a subtle threat of returning to a more active diagonal if the white pawn structure falters. Reclaiming mobility for your knight opens lines for potential pawn advances, aiming to disrupt black's entrenched bishop and create a dynamic in the center. Introducing a tactical check, black forces the white king to a less secure square, potentially disrupting white's coordination and creating opportunities for further pawn advances or piece activity on the queenside. Opening up the king's defenders further by pushing the pawn, this move aims to create a crucial central space advantage and potentially isolate the black bishop from its supporting pawn chain. Exploring the open g-file offers black an immediate avenue to activate the bishop, potentially threatening the white king's pawn shield and creating counterplay. Opening up the knight allows it to potentially reposition and support the pawn push, creating a dynamic pawn structure where white aims to exploit the space advantage. The bishop's repositioning to g6 aims to regain a foothold on the kingside, perhaps eyeing a future skirmish on the h-file or a subtle repositioning to support the knight's eventual advance. The knight repositions, aiming to occupy a more active square on the queenside and exert pressure on white's somewhat exposed king. Capturing the bishop opens a critical diagonal, forcing the white king to an exposed square and potentially setting up a devastating discovered attack. The king tentatively steps into the fray, seeking safety but potentially exposing itself to further discomfort on the open board. The bishop retreats to a square offering potential support for future pawn advances and maintaining a defensive posture against white's somewhat exposed king. Shifting the knight to the kingside pawn chain offers potential support and a repositioning option, preparing to contest the open file or even initiating an attack if opportunities arise. Initiating a bold march, the black king abandons its sanctuary, seeking active participation in the unfolding middle game drama. Knight maneuvers, seeking a better vantage point along the kingside. The king makes a bold dash towards the center, seeking refuge and potential activity amidst the scattered pawns and the bishop's outstretched influence. Re-establishing the knight on its central outpost demonstrates a commitment to solidifying the knight's influence, aiming to control key squares and potentially launch further offensive maneuvers while reinforcing defensive structures. Offering the bishop allows black to solidify its pawn structure and potentially improve coordination, though it relinquishes some attacking potential for a more stable position. Securing the knight's outposting potential, this repositioning prepares to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and potentially pivot the knight to a more active square. The king, abandoning its previously safe harbor, now ventures into the heart of the battlefield, seeking opportunities to participate directly in the unfolding skirmish. Initiating a central realignment, this knight repositions to eye black's pawn structure and prepare for potential advances or exchanges. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal after its brief foray into enemy territory, now looking to support the advancing kingside pawns. Securing the king by forcing a desirable exchange is paramount here, and that's precisely what happens. The pawn's advance to d6 finally solidifies the central pawn structure, offering the king a bit more breathing room and potentially creating a passed pawn down the c-file later. Pushing the pawn now threatens to create a passed pawn and severely restrict black's king's mobility. Embracing the unavoidable, black capitulates to the inevitable pawn advancement and its consequential capture, a stark realization of the material deficit and white's overwhelming central dominance. The white king boldly ventures forward, initiating a daring endgame maneuver where controlling the center and the remaining open files becomes paramount. The bishop's relocation to e6 now seeks to actively contest the weakened dark squares around white's king. Aiming to disrupt any immediate advances or suffocating control white might attempt with their remaining pieces and pawns.